Yeah, I think as we just start to go over to the obviously the British angle, I think we're in a period now where um, we're very much you have a similar phenomenon at the moment on both sides of the Atlantic, with I think non-entities in politics in government that don't really have popular support. They get in on very slender vote shares. I think the same with our current government here and yours. There isn't really a groundswell of enthusiasm. Um, but I don't know if you followed George Friedman at all, but writes a lot about how cyclical America is in terms of both economically and institutionally. And he talks about 50-year economic cycles where something new comes along every 50 years or so to recharge things and get the economy moving again. And you have there's a sort of a golden period where everything's hunky dory, and then at the tail end of it where he says you are now. You've got to the mature end of it and it's run out of steam, but nothing new has come along yet. So you've got this sort of frustrating period. And then he talks about the institutional cycles of which people lose faith in their institutions, which is what's happening. That's every 80 years or so. And he said the two cycles, which has never happened before, are coalescing at the same time. So you've got a winding down of both your institutional cycle and your economic one. Um, and talks about you have transformational presidents for the beginning of each new cycle. So you had in the 20th century you had Franklin D. Roosevelt, and then you had Ronald Reagan, and he said the next one's transformational president will be due around 2028, late 2020s, early 2030s. But I don't know if you're familiar with his work at all, if you've read.
I have heard of him, but I haven't
No.
actually looked into it. That's
No,
something I definitely should look at.
yeah, very interesting chap. You can find him on LinkedIn actually very easily. They regularly post. He runs a think tank called Geopolitical Futures. His specialty is geopolitics, and covers much of the globe. But yeah, fascinating guy. Written quite a lot of interesting books actually, making projections ahead. But anyway, yes. So yeah, I mean, in Britain, I think Britain and America tend to mirror each other in quite a few areas, but uh, I think we're in a similar sort of in some area, in some ways. I don't think in quite maybe it's not such a intense way, but it's a similar sort of period phase, I think, in that regard. But yes, I mean, we have a similar sort of election this year, which really obviously at the end of it, Rishi Sunak, the Conservative sitting Prime Minister, very foolishly, in my view, called the election. He didn't need to call it. He could have waited until either the end of this year, like now, or autumn, or January at the latest, and didn't have to go. He had no chance of winning because trailing about 20 points behind in the polls. But I think he went early. He just wanted to get out. I think he'd had enough. And I think he and could see he wasn't going to be popular the more he stayed in office. But we're at that sort of point. I mean, to understand where we are, you have to sort of go back a few decades really to. I mean, if you go back to 1997, where Tony Blair's New Labour came to power, they came in on the wave of 18 years of conservative dominance. Because I don't know, obviously in America, I think it's pretty, you get an even, more or less even amount of Democratic and Republican administrations. I don't think there's one has particularly more than the other. But in Britain, you tend to get, historically, you've tended to have more conservative governments than Labour governments. Um, yeah, obviously over the 20th century and before prior to sort of the First World War, it was the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party. But traditionally, the British Conservative Party is the most successful electoral organization in the world, and it's the oldest. but it's I think in recent times it's lost its way, and it's not really the Conservative Party anymore. I'd say if you go back to 97, New Labour came in after 18 years of Conservative, just frustration and I suppose tedium with 18 years of Conservative administration after 4 terms in office. You'd had Thatcher, again, very transformational prime minister, most successful peacetime prime minister, in my opinion. And then you had Major after her, and then you had Black Wednesday, and I don't know you're familiar with that, but the Conservative Party has traditionally been had a reputation of being the party of sound money and
Yeah.
responsibility in a way that the Labour Party wasn't, and they could always be relied on to sort out the mess. After
Yeah,
Labour had
they
been in,
help.
and they'd be in for a few terms, and then to have a rest, Labour would come in for 5 years and then they'd be back again. That, but when you got to 97, you'd had such a long period of Conservative administration. You had people, young people who'd never known anything else, and there was just this groundswell of enthusiasm and just desperation. I think just for anything, something different. And then Blair came along. He had a lot of charisma and
Yeah.
personal following, and then so they came in, and the prior rule of Conservative resurgence had gone out of the window, and they just couldn't get re-elected. And then you had David Cameron and George Osborne came along. And they said we need to ape them. They wanted to be the heirs to Blair, and they tried to mimic New Labour, and they ended up moving to the left a bit. So basically the Labour Party moved to the right to appeal to Middle England, and then the Conservative Party moved more to the left, and so they ended up meeting more or less in the same position in the centre. Uh, I think being too heavily obsessed with the centre ground, but and after 2010, after 13 years of Blair and Brown, obviously Blair left office in 2007 after 10 years, and Gordon Brown as Chancellor became Prime Minister, and he wasn't cut out for Prime Minister.
Yeah.
And then, like in your country, you had the effects of the financial crisis, which of course goes against whoever's in power. And then so Cameron and Osborne they won a plurality of seats. They were the largest party, but for the first time in about I think about 80 years, we had a coalition government because like we have first past the post, so it's supposed to create strong government and strong single one party government that's stable and can be relied upon. But that didn't turn out because I think Blair had won such sizable majorities, and he's still got a 60-seat majority in this third time he was elected in 2005. So there was a big hill to climb, and they couldn't, and Cameron couldn't get he couldn't grab the public's imagination and really grab the bull by the horns, as it were. But so he, went and did a deal with the Liberal Democrats, which are sort of like the third party. They're sort of they're more politically aligned with the Labour Party on the left, but they try to be more in the centre. But anyway, as I'm sure you probably know, they did it. There was a coalition government we had for 5 years, and then the Liberal Democrats' vote share collapsed. Their supporters turned away from them because of their coalition with the Conservatives government, which tainted them. It often usually get this in a lot of European countries. It always punishes the junior party, tend to suffer when they do a deal with in their view with the devil. But they so after 5 years of that, they went from about 56 seats down to about eight MPs. And there was some on the election night. There was some doubt whether Nick Clegg, the party leader, would hang on to his seat, but he did. But anyway, then the Conservatives had a small majority against all expectations. And then they went to the country, and of course we had the Brexit referendum.
Yeah.
As Cameron promised if he was re-elected, forced to do it because he didn't wish to. He was a Europhile, like much of the I would say, the left of the One Nation Conservative Party. Well, not I say Europhile, not Euro in the European sense, but very pro EU. But anyway, but he was sort of maneuvered by the right of his party and by these. We had UKIP, which is a bit, I don't know, it's similar to what you had in the States with the Tea Party. It's sort of an extra sort of smaller party to the right of the Conservative Party that was siphoning the Conservative vote share and then threatening the government. So therefore, he was sort of forced into making this concession and agreeing to a referendum, thinking that would placate the right and keep Nigel Farage, who was the leader of obviously the Brexit, the UKIP and later Brexit Party and Reform Now. And of course, it didn't go the way he'd expected and lost that. So then, of course, he had to resign because he'd been so staunchly fighting to remain. Then you had Theresa May for a few years, and she was pretty hopeless. I mean, she wasn't elected for a start. So I've written actually an article on this. I've studied past elections, past British elections, and what you tend to find is that prime ministers, on the whole, that are unelected, don't have to face the electorate, don't tend to fare very well when they're in office. They don't succeed electorally. The only exceptions to the rule were John Major and Anthony Eden. But most others in modern times have tended to only last. Well, they don't win them, handsomely in elections. But so anyway, you had Theresa May's, and then she went to the country in 2017 expecting to expand her majority. She had a 20-point lead against the Labour Party, against Jeremy Corbyn, and that she launched a disastrous campaign. She couldn't. She wasn't a gifted politician, and then lost the majority, but still came out as the largest party in Parliament. And so then you had this sort of a few years of deadlock and paralysis where nothing could get done. And then, of course, Boris Johnson, waiting in the wings, came along and replaced her, and he fired it all up on all cylinders and got Parliament to agree to an election and won an 80-seat majority. Got Brexit through, and then, of course, like in your country, COVID hit, and then we had you had to deal with that, and that led to various problems in his personality. And scandals, in breaking COVID regulations, which I think he would have probably come to the same end eventually anyhow, because he's that sort of individual. He can't sort of help himself. But I always thought that he would have the discipline, or he had I mean, he was previously mayor of London, and he had as mayor of London, he had a good team around him to back him up and sort out the minutiae, the details of governing, which everyone thought he would have in as prime minister, which he didn't do. And so he just came unraveled. And then just after COVID, really, he fell on his sword and had to resign. And then you had the leadership election, and then so that tainted the reputation of the party to a certain extent. Then Liz Truss won the leadership election of the party, because we don't have primaries here. We just have, how it works is we're a parliamentary system, so we have the public don't vote for the prime minister, they vote for the party. So they simply you vote for your member of parliament. So you have a country of constituencies, about over 600 constituencies, something like 600. I think it's 626 constituencies, something like that, across the country, and you have your member of parliament, and then the party which has the majority of MPs gets in, and the prime minister is the leader of the party, who is elected by the members of the party. So it's Conservative members that voted for Liz Truss. So she automatically became prime minister because obviously the party was in power. So you had about, I don't know, a few 100,000 people, including myself at the time, who voted for that. She was promising to take the party back to more traditional policies on spending and tax and so on. And she turned out to be an absolute disaster. She couldn't her and her chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng completely um, they just went too fast and you didn't plan or didn't think ahead at all and just were totally reckless and caused panic in the financial markets and uh, and they were ousted from power. They there's nothing that they couldn't, she couldn't do any of the things that she'd promised in the election. So she I think there was debate of as to which would last longer, her or a lettuce. But that was the newspaper headlines at the time. But she lasted a few months um, and was out. And then by that time, you had the Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who'd been Chancellor under Boris Johnson. He had he was elected by the MPs because there was no other candidate left that could challenge him. So it didn't need to go to the party members. So he just became prime minister. Again, he was a capable chancellor, but he wasn't a politician, a shrewd politician either. So he was competent, as in being a caretaker and could manage things, but and he got inflation under control. That's no mean feat. And he got the finances under control. He stabilized and calmed the markets. Um, and everyone was, as I said, was expecting him to wait till, as long as he possibly could go before going to the country. This obviously massive lead that Labour had, largely because of what Liz Truss did by effectively spooking the money markets and as some have said, crashing the economy, which is not strictly true. It did bounce back, but it basically caused mortgages to skyrocket. Um, and it's economic blunders like that. The public don't forgive. Historically, they don't forgive parties in power, especially not the Conservative Party, which is all the worse. As happened in the 90s with John Major and Black Wednesday, when we I don't know if you're familiar, but we withdrew from the exchange rate mechanism, which caused a similar problem, and that they still remember years afterwards. So that we were always going to lose, but I think we wouldn't have lost as badly. But anyway, when the inevitable result came, uh, Labour got in, but with a historically small share of the vote. So they got in with about 33% of the popular vote, with about 2/3 of the seats. It was exaggerate. It's one of the sort of foibles of our first past the post system. You can have this situation where the seats don't reflect the share of the votes, as with other parties. So Reform, which are the later income version of Brexit Party in UKIP under Nigel Farage, um, who's a big pal of Donald Trump, by the way. But he's basically come to the fore uh, because the Conservative Party has vacated much of its traditional policy areas and has really gone to the left. I mean, it's campaign time and again on Conservative policies, and then when it gets into power, it's sort of veered to more liberal policy positions and hasn't really failed to govern competently. And so it's just lost its way and hence why we had such a sizable result last July. So anyway, you've now got a Labour government which is probably one of the most boring, uninspiring, unpopular, lightweight administrations that we've ever had. Um, they're obviously they're secure for the next 5 years. They got a majority of well over 100. So and I think I said to you, I've met on messages. I think I conveyed to you before. They've inherited a lot of the improved economic situation that we've now got. So the fall in inflation they've inherited, which we've got back to our the target around 2%. It was around 10% during just after COVID, and largely due to COVID, and of course into the Ukraine war, which for a time it was externally caused inflation, but also caused by the domestic spending during COVID of all the putting people on furlough and shutting down the economy, which caused untold damage for a period of time. But anyway, they've inherited, the bounce back from that, and they're now trying to claim that there's this massive deficit, which they've sort of exaggerated by various spending decisions. But it's early days yet. I mean, we'll have to see what how it goes on. But as I say, I think we're politically, in terms of um, divisiveness, potential gridlock, not gridlock, but yes, I don't, yeah, uninspiring leadership, should we say, I think is a common theme on both sides of the pond.